Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our midweek study. I hope you're having a great week, and thus far it's been a rather cold and snowy week, but I continue to be grateful for this opportunity that we have in the warmth and comfort of our own homes to be able to get together and share this time together in the study of the Word of God, especially in this Cloud of Witnesses study that we've been engaged in over the last several weeks. 2 weeks ago, we began a consideration of the life of Joseph as a part of this Cloud of Witnesses, one of these great people of faith in generations and centuries and millennia past. And we continued that discussion last week, and we'll be concluding our discussion of Joseph in tonight's lesson. But through the chapters in Genesis that we'll be covering tonight, we'll get to see this beautiful, powerful, moving story of reconciliation and forgiveness between Joseph and his brothers. After all these years, after all the harm and hurt and hardship that had come upon Joseph as a result of the actions, the hatred-filled actions, the jealousy-motivated actions of his own flesh and blood, still he finds it within his heart to forgive them and to return their evil with good, and gives us such a powerful example in that regard. But he does that only after tormenting them and torturing them for about 3 chapters with anxiety and fear and stress and intimidation that extends all the way back to Canaan, to the heart of his own father. And so we'll discuss that as a part of our study together tonight as well. 1,300 years after the life of Joseph, we have the life of Daniel as a captive in Babylon, much as Joseph was in the foreign land of Egypt. And you remember how God used Daniel to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel 2:26, Nebuchadnezzar asked Daniel, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" And very humbly, Daniel replies in verse 27 of Daniel 2, "There is no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner who can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." A God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And God was doing that 1,300 years earlier through Joseph. And you remember from our discussion last week how Joseph is able to interpret the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker that Pharaoh had cast into prison, and how because of the revelation, the insight that Joseph was given, his interpretation of those dreams came to pass 3 days later on Pharaoh's birthday. The cupbearer is restored to his position of high prominence and authority in the court of Pharaoh. Sadly, the baker is executed by Pharaoh. And for some reason, the cupbearer, I don't know if it's just elation because of the fact that his life isn't taken, the fact that he's got his old job back, the fact that life is good again, he just forgets about Joseph. He forgets how he was told 3 days ahead of time that this was going to happen just as it transpired. And it's 2 years that pass before the cupbearer remembers. And he remembers because of the double-barrel dream, the back-to-back dreams that Pharaoh has that greatly disturb his heart. The dreams that he has about the fat, sleek cows and the scrawny, ugly cows, and about the 7 full heads of grain and the scorched, worthless heads of grain. And Joseph says to Pharaoh much what Daniel will 1,300 years later say to Nebuchadnezzar. In Genesis 41:16, Joseph says, "It's not in me, Pharaoh, but God will give you a favorable answer. I can't do it. I can't interpret your dreams, but God can, and God will, and God has, and this is what it means." What it means is 7 years of unprecedented prosperity, bumper crops, booming economy. We'll be raking in grain hand over fist. But that's going to be followed by 7 years of unprecedented famine. And so we've got to prepare for that. Joseph was given command of the operation by Pharaoh. And we have to give Pharaoh some credit here as well. He had the option of believing Joseph or not, accepting his counsel and his interpretation or rejecting it. Thankfully, Pharaoh was wise enough to accept it. And he puts Joseph in charge of this operation of gathering 20% of these bumper crops over the next 7 years and putting them in storehouses to the extent that they just stopped keeping track of it. There's too much to even keep records of. Joseph is given Pharaoh's signet ring and garments of fine linen and a gold necklace and the second chariot. And that, Pharaoh didn't have Air Force One. I guess he had Ground Force One, that particular chariot, but Ground Force Two, second in command, was Joseph's chariot, and all were to bow the knee to him. Joseph's word was law in Egypt. And then these 7 years of prosperity follow, and a fifth of the grain, 20%, was exacted from the people and stored under Joseph's supervision. And then when the famine hits, and not just hits Egypt, hits that whole region of the world, the storehouses were then opened and grain was sold to the people. And that takes us to the end of Genesis chapter 41. So Genesis 42 picks up with the scene transitioning back to Canaan with Jacob and his 11 sons, and things are getting difficult. Things are getting desperate to the point that he says to his sons in Genesis 42:1, why do you just keep looking at each other? It seems, I get the mental picture that they're just sitting around staring at one another, trying to figure out what they need to do. But Jacob has heard that there is grain in Egypt, and he sends his sons there, not 11 of his sons, only 10 of his sons. Benjamin is going to stay with his father. He was the second of Rachel's sons. Joseph has been gone for between 20 and 22 years at this point, assumed dead by his father. He doesn't want to take any chances with Benjamin. But I don't know what you remember from Bible class material that you may have had either as a student when you were growing up, or Bible class material that you may have used in teaching the story of Joseph. But we don't need to imagine Benjamin as some young boy, but as a young man. Remember, Joseph has been gone for between 20 and 22 years. I don't know how old Benjamin was at the time that Joseph was sold by his brothers, but he's got to be a man in his probably at least mid to late 20s. Joseph is going to be about 39 years old at this time. But there's no way that even at that age, Jacob is going to let him go. So he sends his other 10 sons. And when they appear before their brother Joseph in Egypt, there's no way they could possibly recognize him. So much time has passed, and they simply fall to the ground on their faces before him. And when they do that, Jacob remembers those dreams from all those years ago, those dreams of the sheaves of his brothers bowing down before his sheaf. The sight in his dream of 11 stars bowing down to him. Here, 10 of his brothers are bowing down to him. So they don't recognize him. Too much time has passed. He's in a totally different context. The last place they would expect Joseph to be was there. And yet he recognizes them, the 10 brothers that were involved in selling him into slavery. And he shows great restraint. It was within Joseph's power. Remember, his word is law. If he truly believed them to be spies, all he would have to do is give the word and they would be killed. So if he had been given to vengeance and violence and retribution, he could have spoken the word and they could have met the same fate as came upon Pharaoh's chief baker. Lesser men than Joseph would have delighted in seeing the birds pick the flesh off of the impaled bodies of his brothers. But there's no room for that in Joseph's heart. However, he's not quite yet willing to let bygones be bygones. As my grandmother in Georgia used to say, Joseph has buried the hatchet, but he left the handle sticking out. So it would be handy if he ever needed it. And at this point, he grabs the handle of the hatchet. And in this, we see Joseph's humanity. Joseph is not held up as a perfect example. He's held up as a faithful example. And he could have revealed himself right then and there. And if Joseph had done that, there would only be 47 chapters in Genesis. There wouldn't be 50 chapters. 3 chapters are filled with the ongoing saga of this gradual revelation of Joseph to his brothers. He speaks to them harshly, and he instills in them anxiety and stress and fear and intimidation. And he accuses them, even though he knows exactly who they are. He pretends to believe that he takes them as foreign spies who are there to find holes in the defenses of Egypt, even though he knows for a fact that that's not the case. And he chooses to follow a path of deception. It wasn't right. It wasn't ethical. It wasn't moral. Joseph does it anyway because I don't know how long it's been since he has thought about his brothers and his father and his younger brother, Benjamin. Maybe he thought about them every day. Maybe he had just so completely turned the page that seems like it was another lifetime ago. And now, totally unexpectedly, he doesn't know his brothers are coming. Totally unexpectedly, his brothers are there. And all of those memories start flooding back, all of those feelings. And he's not ready to say, I'm Joseph, your brother. I forgive you. So he keeps repeating this charge that they are spies, and he chooses to follow a path of deceit, just like his father Jacob had done early in his life, in deceiving his father Isaac out of his blessing. He's following a path of deceit like his brothers had done, in leading their father to believe that Joseph had been devoured by a wild animal, and they have just bought into and lived by that deceit for the last 22 years. So he accuses them of being spies on a reconnaissance mission, and his brothers keep repeating that this defense, no, we're not. We're honest men. We're men of integrity. We can be trusted. And they don't know the one to whom they're speaking, the one who knows about their lack of integrity, their lack of honesty. But they maintained that even still, they were 12 brothers. One of them, the youngest, was back home with their father, and one of them was no longer alive. They might have assumed at some point, I don't know how often they thought about Joseph after they sold him, but at some point they might have just assumed that he was dead. That often, sadly, happened to slaves who were sold into the hands of merciless masters, or they might have just maintained the lie long enough with their father that eventually they began to believe it. You know, if you repeat an untruth often enough, that becomes your alter reality. You start believing what you're saying, even though initially in your own heart, you know it's not true. And so as they introduce themselves and try to defend themselves before Joseph, they maintain that one of the 12 brothers was dead. Joseph tells them that he's not buying their story. And initially, all of them are going to be kept in custody, in prison, and one of them is going to be sent back to their father to bring their youngest brother. And so he holds them all in custody for 3 days. I mean, he had spent 13 years as a slave and in prison, a total of 13 years between the age of 17 and 30. He had spent 13 years as a slave and in prison, and 3 days doesn't seem like too much for his brothers to be put in jail. During that 3-day period, though, he changes the scenario. He's not going to send one brother back and keep the 9. He's going to keep one brother there and send the 9 back to their father with the charge to bring back the youngest brother. And at this point, there among themselves comes a declaration of guilt. They don't know that Joseph can understand them. They've been using an interpreter to speak to Joseph. They speaking their Semitic language, Joseph speaking the language of Egypt, and an interpreter translating for them. They don't realize that Joseph can understand everything that they're saying. And so verse 21, they said to one another, surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. And Joseph is able to hear that they're not quite as heartless as he had probably believed they were for the last 22 years. For them to have sold him like that, Joseph must have thought, my brothers don't even have a soul. Now he hears their conversation and realizes they did see my face. They did hear my cries and my pleas for my life. And he hears his oldest brother, Reuben. This is something he likely hasn't known. Reuben replies, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? Remember, Reuben, the oldest brother, had a plan that he was going to rescue Joseph from the cistern and send him back safely to his father. The passage of 22 years isn't long enough to keep Reuben from saying, I told you so. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, but you wouldn't listen? Now we must give an accounting for his blood. And here he hears this confession of guilt, this confession of shame that the blood, the innocent blood of their brother was on their hands. And verse 23, they didn't realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. And at this point, Joseph just has to turn away and shed some tears because he realizes there is some humanity in his brothers. There is some goodness there. And maybe it's because, normally he might keep Reuben, the oldest brother, as the hostage, and as he sends the other brothers back. But he's just heard Reuben describe how he tried to rescue Joseph. And so he takes the second-born brother, Simeon, and puts him in jail and fills the bags of the other brothers with grain, as well as the money that they had brought, the silver that they had brought as payment for the grain. He puts that back in their bags, gives them provisions for their journey, and sends them back home. And when they discover that the money is in their bags, they're frightened. I mean, they've already been terrified. Back in verse 28, their hearts sank. They were trembling. And now, verse 35, as they were emptying their sacks, and there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver, then when they and their father saw the money pouches, that they were frightened. And their father Jacob said to them, you've deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. He's down in Egypt. And now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is against me. And at this point, Reuben, the oldest, says to his father, you can put both of my sons to death if I don't bring him back to you. And I'm sure Reuben's 2 sons were thinking, well, thanks a lot, Dad. We appreciate that. Entrust him to my care. I will bring him back. And Jacob flatly says, no way am I letting Benjamin go with you back to Egypt. My son will not go there with you. His brother is dead. He's the only one left. And at that point, all the brothers are probably thinking, well, thanks a lot, Dad. You really think a lot of us if you think Benjamin is the only one you have left. And Jacob says, if harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow. So that's the way it's going to be. They're not going back to Egypt. They're not taking Benjamin. And Simeon, sorry, you're just going to have to stay in jail. And we don't know how much time passes that Simeon is left there, but I'm sure he's being taken care of some way, somehow, by Joseph, without Simeon knowing that Joseph is his brother. And that's the way things stand until things just get so bad that something has to be done. The grain that they brought back from Egypt is gone. And now it's a life or death situation. And Jacob wants to send them back without Benjamin, and they flatly refuse to go. They're not going unless Benjamin goes with them. And Judah accepts full responsibility for Benjamin until finally Jacob relents. And he says, may God Almighty grant you compassion in the sight of this man down in Egypt, the second in command in the whole country. And if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. And so they take money once again, double the money. They take the original price for the first shipment of grain, and they take as much again, along with gifts to give to Joseph. And it lets us know that even though there's not grain, Jacob is still a wealthy man. He sends balm and honey and spices and myrrh and pistachio nuts and almonds. May not be any grain to make bread, but there are pistachios, there are almonds, and they go back to Egypt. And when Joseph sees them and he perceives that Benjamin is with them, he gives instructions for them to be taken to Joseph's house. And they think that this is a setup, that they're going to be put to death there. Verse 17, the man did as Joseph told him and took his brothers. This was his steward that took his brothers to Joseph's house. Verse 18, now the men were frightened when they were taken to his house. They thought, we were brought here because of the silver that was put back into our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys. This is over. We're done for. But the steward said, after they lay their case out before Joseph's steward, the steward says in verse 23 of Genesis 43, it's all right. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you your treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. Then he brought Simeon out to them, and he allows them to wash up. Their donkeys are taken care of. And then Joseph comes into their presence, and they present him with the gifts that Jacob had sent. Joseph asked them how they were, and then he said, how is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? I don't know how much time has transpired, but he wants to know about the health, the welfare of his father. They replied, your servant, our father, is still alive and well. They bowed down, prostrating themselves before him. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? He hasn't seen him in between 20 and 22 years. Benjamin would have changed a lot during that time. He wants to make sure that this is his beloved younger brother. Deeply moved. Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. And then after he washes his face, he comes back out and says, serve the food. And Joseph is sitting by himself. The Egyptian officials are sitting by themselves, and his brothers are seated together, and they're seated in birth order. And at some point, during the feast, this dawns on them, that they are seated from the oldest to the youngest. The men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. Has anybody noticed our seating arrangement is in birth order? How could that happen? I mean, I can imagine one of them saying, "Yeah, I'm older than you, but I look a lot younger than you." Nobody could have guessed this. And then Benjamin had received 5 times as much food as anyone else. So they feasted and they drank freely. And then they are going to be sent back to their father with full provisions. But as they are being loaded with grain, their money is once again put back in their bags. And at Joseph's instruction, his silver cup is placed in Benjamin's bag. Then the steward, the official, is sent after them. They're stopped. They're accused of stealing. And they are so certain that this would never happen. Why would we steal? Let's see. Verse 8, we even brought back to you from the land of Canaan the silver we found inside the mouths of our sacks. So why would we steal silver or gold from your master's house? If any of your servants is found to have it, he will die. If that cup is found in anybody's bag, just put them to death on the spot, and the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. They start going through the bags from the oldest to the youngest, and they probably think they're out of the woods when they come to Benjamin's sack. The brothers do, and that's exactly where the cup is found. Verse 13, at this they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. And this is where they just lay their case, beg for mercy before Joseph. And Judah does the speaking for them. And let's just read this together, beginning in verse 18 of Genesis 44. Then Judah went up to him and said, pardon your servant, my Lord. Let me speak a word to my Lord. Don't be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servants, do you have a father or a brother? And we answered, we have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead. He's the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me so that I can see him for myself. And we said to my Lord, the boy can't leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die. But you told your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again. When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him what my Lord had said. Then our father said, go back, buy a little more food. But we said, we can't go down. Only if our younger brother is with us will we go. We cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. So now, if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up in the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, if Benjamin's put to death, if you keep him here and don't send him back, my father will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant, I, Judah, guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. And this is where Judah's nobility shines through. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. And this is where Joseph just can't hold it together anymore. He can't control himself. and his emotions. So he sends the Egyptians out, and he starts weeping so loudly that the Egyptians outside can hear him. And word even gets to Pharaoh about the tears and the wailing that are coming from Joseph. And he tells his brothers, it's me. It's Joseph. I'm alive. Is my father still alive? And his brothers are simply stunned. They're not able to answer. They're still terrified at his presence. Verse 4, then Joseph said to his brothers, this is verse 4 of chapter 45, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And he tells them the rest of the story. He tells them that he wants them all, including his father, to come live with him. He's probably already figured this after the first visit, after he has sent them back. He knows that he's not going to kill any of his brothers. He knows that he's not going to leave any of his brothers imprisoned. He knows that he wants to bring his father and his brothers and their wives and their children all down to Egypt. And he tells them, I will provide for you. But he also tells them, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Verse 8, going back to verse 6, for 2 years now, there has been famine in the land. For the next 5 years, there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. Verse 8, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler over all Egypt. So go back home, get our father. And then the reunion with his brother, verse 14. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. So he sends them back loaded to Canaan. He gives them all a new change of clothes. But he gave Benjamin 5 sets of clothes and 300 shekels of silver. That's 15 times the amount of silver that they had received as payment when they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites to be sent to Egypt. 20 shekels of silver. That was the price of a slave. He gives his brother 15 times that amount, 300 shekels of silver. Jacob is stunned when he gets the news. He doesn't believe them, and you can't blame them. For 22 years, he has believed that his son was dead. He grieved over him day after day, week after week, year after year. Finally, verse 28, Israel, Jacob said, I'm convinced my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. And so the migration of Jacob and his sons and their families down to Egypt. And an incredible reunion with his father when Jacob gets there. This is verse 29 of Genesis 46. Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel, Jacob, said to Joseph, now I'm ready to die, since I've seen for myself that you are still alive. I can die a happy, content man if I died today, because I know that you are alive. I know that you are well. I know that you have prospered. I know that God has protected you. And now through you, we are being protected and provided for. Just one last note. After Jacob dies, his brothers become fearful that the only reason they've been allowed to live is out of Joseph's respect for his father, and that he would never exact vengeance against them while their father was still alive. And so they come to their brother. They say, we are your slaves. They come fearful. They're afraid that Joseph might be like them, but he's not. Joseph said to them in verse 19 of Genesis 50, don't be afraid. am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Constantly making sure that their hearts are comforted after all of the pain and the heartache and the hardship that they have caused him. He's willing to be concerned about their welfare and even their emotional comfort and their emotional strength. And even though, again, this is so long before the writing of New Testament scripture, Joseph really embodies for us, I think, what Paul expresses in Romans chapter 12. And with this reading, we will close tonight. Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 17. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. Think about the grain that Joseph gave to his brothers and sent to his father, the feast that he prepared for them. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Joseph suffered some evil, some darkness at the hands of his own flesh and blood. They sold him as a slave. He suffered evil from the lies and the false accusations of Potiphar's wife. He suffered the evil of neglect and forgetfulness on the part of the cupbearer. And yet it doesn't result in an all-consuming bitterness within him. He takes those things in stride. He continues to trust in God. And because he continues to trust in God and maintain his ethics and his morals and his standards, God prospers him. And ultimately, even though he lets them turn in the wind there for about 3 chapters and causes this stress and anxiety and fear and intimidation within them, ultimately he returns their evil with good. And that's the ethic of Jesus. That's the standard of Christ. That's what sets Christians apart from every other system of belief upon this planet. And that's what we're called to. That's the standard by which we are called to live. And I think maybe that's why Joseph is rated that mention in Hebrews chapter 11, to remind us of just what an incredible example of that he is. We will pick up next week with discussion of another Joseph next Wednesday night. But thanks again for being a part of the study this evening. And I hope you have a great rest of the week. And we look forward to seeing you on Sunday morning, either in person in the auditorium or through the live stream. God bless you all and have a wonderful evening.